Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to break down the incredibly complex and honestly fascinating relationship between religion, gender roles, and power. I'm thrilled to guide you through this. We're going to use real insights from sociology, theology, and human rights data to look way beyond the surface-level assumptions and really dissect the anatomy of tradition. Whether you consider yourself deeply religious, purely secular, or anywhere in between, understanding how these belief systems shape societal norms is absolutely crucial to understanding our world today.
Okay, so let's kick things off by tackling a massive question right out of the gate. Is religion inherently oppressive, or is it a space of perfect equality? Well, the data and sociological research tell us that neither absolute is true. It's actually really inaccurate to just point a finger at religion as the single root cause of gender inequality. But on the flip side, it would be completely inaccurate to pretend religious institutions are these flawless utopias of equal rights. Religion just doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It's constantly bumping up against political power, economic realities, and cultural expectations.
So the reality isn't a simple binary. Instead, we have to look at something scholars call the power of interpretation, or if you prefer the German term, Deutungsmacht. This concept is a real game changer. We have to start asking not just what a religion says, but who holds the actual authority to decide what it means. Who gets to stand up and say what's valid, what's pious, and what's binding? When you realize that the power to interpret the rules is essentially the power to control the culture, the whole thing starts to make a lot more sense. To truly grasp these mechanics of belief, we're going to unpack this step by step through 5 key areas. 1. Texts and authority. 2. Family and the body. 3. Education and impact. 4. Voices of reform. And 5. State, media, and the future. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Texts and Authority, which we can think of as the pipeline of power. This pipeline brilliantly illustrates that a sacred text doesn't just speak for itself. It goes through a highly human-driven process. First, you start with the ancient text itself. Then, step 2, you have translation. And believe me, deciding to translate a word as helper versus equal partner literally changes history. Step 3 is interpretation, where some passages get heavily elevated while others are quietly downplayed. And finally, step 4, institutionalization. That's where these selective human interpretations get locked in as the hard rules of a community. Recognizing this pipeline helps us see that a lot of gender norms are built over time, not just inherently given from day one.
Now when we break down that authority, things get really interesting. Look at how this is split. Women and marginalized groups often hold immense informal sway in their communities. They've historically been the absolute backbone of religious transmission, as mothers, teachers, and community builders who shape everyday spiritual identity. But formal authority, the priests, the judges, the leadership, that's historically been highly restricted and male-dominated. Setting official doctrine, managing the money, defining the rules, that formal power gap is a massive point of friction today.
Moving on to Section 2, Family and the Body, looking specifically at physical expectations. At the very core of this tension, both sides are looking at the family unit, but they are prioritizing totally different things. The conservative position views distinct gender roles almost like a puzzle that perfectly fits together. It emphasizes complementary roles to protect family stability from modern isolation. The reformist view, however, warns against this. They point out that when one person is expected to be the sole provider and the other the sole caregiver, it can create highly dangerous economic dependencies and seriously limit a person's individual agency. And this dynamic extends directly to the physical body. Dress codes and purity rules are a perfect example. For some, these visible norms are profound expressions of voluntary spiritual identity and deep empowerment. But they can also act as mechanisms for intense social or even state control, particularly over women and queer individuals. The main takeaway here, a piece of clothing is never just a piece of clothing. A head covering can be a powerful, voluntary rejection of consumerist beauty standards for one woman, while for another, it's heavily enforced by state pressure. The underlying question we have to ask is always, who has the agency to choose? Next up, Section 3, Education and Impact. Let's look at access to knowledge. International human rights frameworks really emphasize that while religious freedom is absolutely vital, communities actually have an obligation to challenge interpretations that legitimize gender inequality. The UN Human Rights Office isn't saying religion is a bad thing, not at all. But their Faith for Rights framework creates this crucial space where religious freedom and human dignity have to coexist. If a specific interpretation of a text is being used to strip people of their basic rights or justify violence, the international community argues there's a moral duty to rethink that interpretation. You can see the real-world impact of this tension in practices like child marriage. Organizations like UNESCO and UNICEF know that to protect a girl's right to education, they can't just parachute in and impose secular laws from the outside. That rarely works. Instead, they actively engage in respectful, firm dialogues with local, traditional, and religious leaders. When faith leaders themselves start advocating for keeping girls in school, the cultural shift is incredibly powerful.
To put that into a global perspective, the World Bank tracks legal and economic frameworks across 190 different economies. And what they find proves a crucial point. Without formal education and economic independence, individuals have a vastly harder time claiming the power to interpret religious texts for themselves. Think about it. If you literally don't have the economic means to support yourself, it is remarkably difficult to push back against a restrictive religious or family norm. Economic access and education aren't just secular concerns, they're the very tools you need to participate equally in your own religious community. That brings us to Section 4, Voices of Reform, specifically highlighting global feminism.
Because the push for change isn't just coming from the outside, it's being driven powerfully by believers themselves. Scholars and activists are refusing to leave their traditions. Instead, they're diving deep into sacred texts and historical research to reclaim female leadership. This is global religious feminism, and it's happening everywhere, across Christian theology, Muslim core and exegesis, Jewish rabbinical movements, Buddhist non-ordinations, and indigenous spiritual leadership. These aren't secular outsiders trying to dismantle a faith. These are devoted insiders going back to original languages, uncovering forgotten female prophets, and arguing that true equality was actually the original intent of their tradition, not just some modern Western import. We also have to neutrally examine the incredibly intense, actively evolving debate around queer believers. Traditional doctrines often rely on a strict interpretation of a divine creation order, viewing gender as strictly binary and marriage as exclusively heterosexual. This leads to heavy structural exclusion. Queer believers, however, are shifting the theological lens. They're advocating for inclusion by asking their communities, shouldn't our religious ethics be measured by dignity, our capacity for love, nonviolence, and conscience, rather than rigid identity control? It is a profound debate happening in congregations all over the world right now.
Finally, let's wrap things up with Section 5, State, Media, and the Future. We'll call this the dual challenge.
Ultimately, modern democracies are forced into an incredible tightrope walk. This is the dual challenge. States and courts have to protect a religion's institutional autonomy and freedom from state overreach. You definitely don't want the government dictating theology. But simultaneously, the state absolutely cannot look away if religious norms are being used to excuse abuse, forced marriage, or severe discrimination. Balancing the protection of the group with the protection of the individual is one of the greatest tests societies face today. And if you throw the internet into the mix, things get even wilder. Digital media has completely disrupted traditional authority. A young believer doesn't just get their theology from their local leader once a week anymore. They're online. Now, on one hand, algorithms love to amplify extreme, polarizing, fundamentalist viewpoints because, well, outrage gets clicks. But on the other hand, the internet gives marginalized voices a platform to build digital counterpublics. A reformist or a queer believer can now find a global community of support that they might never have found in their physical hometown. The power of interpretation has literally gone digital. So I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought to chew on. As these incredibly diverse communities navigate the future, how can tradition be preserved without limiting participation? Is it possible for a faith to deeply honor its ancient roots while ensuring that absolutely every member, regardless of gender, has a seat at the table and a voice in the text? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.